Episode 10, Salt, Saving Food for Later. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll look at how most 17th century salt was made. And there will be just a little chemistry, because that was one of my old gigs. And we'll spend plenty of time looking at how salt was used in the early colonial kitchen. So pull up to your place at the table, and let's dig in. Last week, we left off where the whole world was starting to trade valuable stuff and shoot at each other using boats. This meant salt production had gone from a pretty local thing to an international industry, which, as I am learning, is what lots of things did in the 17th century. It wasn't that no one was moving stuff around on an intercontinental scale before then. It's just it became much more regular. Moving stuff around the world was becoming an industry where you could make money, not just something wandering cranks did. I mean, when Marco Polo came back from China in the 13th century, they locked him up because they thought he was some kind of dangerous nutter. By the 17th century, Chinese silks and porcelain plates were the new hotness at the Spanish court. Books were being written about and maps were being drawn of the New World, and they were being published and printed in paper books that even kind of regular people could afford. I mean, William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation fame brought a store of books with him and had a library of 400 books upon his death. And he wasn't royalty or nobility or even a merchant. So information was getting out there. The New World, as indistinct as it was a known thing. People went there and came back, some with serious money. Not many to be sure, but enough that the lure was strong. And this is why, along with the trade in sugar and slaves and fish, the trade in salt had also gone into overdrive in the 17th century. As part of the boom in salt production, that sailing supply depot, the Canary Islands, entered the salt trade in 1605. There are still brine ponds there even now, though they're in a different location. This salt would be used to prepare the questionable beef, sometimes possibly goat and donkey meat, I don't know, sold to boats resupplying there. Large amounts of the salt would also go to fishing boats as they went to catch cod to sell back to the European market, or as the population grew, to new markets in the New World. Just the plain salt could be sold to the colonials, since efficient salt production had yet to be set up. The salt trade had increased to industrial quantities and had gone global. When the Europeans arrived, there was definitely some, but a very limited salt culture in North America. Mainly it was household or village-level salt production. On the coasts and in areas that have salt flats or salt pans, that means dirt that has a large amount of salt mixed in, this would be mixed with fresh or seawater to create a strong brine, filtered, and then boiled to precipitate crystals. Salty stuff would also be made by burning plants that tasted salty. These halophytes, it's a constructed word from the Greek hal for salt and phyte for plant, take up salt present in the sand or dirt where they grow and store it in their leaves. These plants are also known colloquially as saltbush, or by more evocative names like glasswort or pickleweed. Fun fact, most of these halophyte bushes are under the umbrella of the plant family Amaranthaceae, which contains our old friends goosefoot, amaranth, and quinoa, the ancient companion to teosinte and corn. Not only would these salty ashes be used to season food, in the Southwest, where trees were scarce, that burned salty plant matter was also used for corn nixtamalization. If you're curious about what a salty plant might taste like, right now in the modern cooking universe, a seaside succulent known as samphire or sea bean or salicornia is a halophyte people are eating. It's currently a specialty vegetable and can mainly be found through people who are into foraged edibles. In pre-colonial America, besides seawater and salty plants, Salt springs, also known as salines, were another source of salt. These happen when an underground deposit of salt from an ancient dried-up sea crosses paths with groundwater that rises through it. Salt spring water is typically close to seawater in salt content, sometimes a bit higher, often a bit lower. They are usually identified by the white salt surface deposits that surround them. Pans and basins were often carved in the rocks that these springs would seep out of by local tribes for passive salt making. These salt springs are sprinkled all over the country. All you need to do is look for names like Salt Spring and Saline, which you'll find in Florida, Michigan, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, California. Just pick a state. Before mechanical salt production, a salt spring was totally worth making note of. There are large salt deposits in the future U.S. that would become salt mines starting mostly in the 19th century. These were accessed in a limited way by Native Americans. What little we know of their use is mainly limited to the observation by Spanish explorers mentioning trade in solid chunks of salt by Native Americans. But in the colonization plan, no one was counting on finding salt springs or salt mines. The colonies would be right on the sea. So along with the plan to set up the Pilgrims as a fishing colony, it was expected that they would also be able to produce all the salt and brine they needed to ship the fish back. After all, England is at 51 degrees north latitude and had saltworks at Cheshire and before that Lincolnshire on the North Sea. Brittany, France's most famous salt-producing region, is on the north side of the country at 48 degrees north. So, since Boston is at 42 degrees north and Jamestown is at 37 degrees north, both much further south, this Plymouth location must surely be quite temperate and an excellent place to produce sea salt. Since weather radar and climate maps were not yet a thing, the English investors didn't understand how airflows and ocean currents created the unusually temperate climate of England, and no one, especially the Pilgrims, were ready for the reality of a Massachusetts winter. Boy, were they wrong about the salt-producing possibilities of Cape Cod. As the 17th century went on, and coastal economies got themselves organized around paying off their colonial debts, fishing started to work out, along with grain and livestock exports. But, other than some limited salt boiling for household use, there was no salt industry. The salt used for the fish exports in the 17th century was imported first from Britain and later from British possessions in the Caribbean, particularly the Bahamas. Most of the imported salt was made by evaporating seawater using solar and wind energy. For the American market, there were only two main kinds of this solar sea salt. The nice kitchen stuff was called bay salt and requires more skill and effort. Common salt, what people used for making brines, salting fish and meat, was coarser and blockier and was made as passively as possible. The fine and fancy, delicate fleur-de-sel and flake salts could also be made using the solar and wind methods, but these were, and in the 21st century are, specialty products that require practice, technique, and a market to support them. The 17th century colonies were out for quantity, and America would continue to prefer quantity and purity. Fancy, delicate specialty salts with delicate impurities, therefore, wouldn't make much headway on American shores until the 21st century. One fun part about specialty salt gaining a foothold in the modern American market is that you can now easily see what 17th century American salt looked and tasted like. All you need to do is poke around the spice section of one of the giant 21st century American grocery stores. Or you can go to one of those specialty salt shops that are popping up all over the world. To see 17th century bay salt, it was spelled both B-A-Y or B-A-I-E. Look at what is currently sold as sel gris. This is just French for gray salt, and is due to a very little bit of the material of the bottom of the salt evaporating pan ending up in the salt. In the French salt, it's a gray clay. But these bay salts were and are often tinted other colors like red, yellow, black, or brown, depending on the minerals in the brine ponds where they are made. Bay salt would also usually be a bit damp because it is passively drained of the brine it is taken from. That last little bit is pretty difficult to entirely remove without heating it. Because fully drying the salt would require using a bunch of extra energy, it was typically sold as is. In the kitchen, it was generally used in the larger grains it comes in, but occasionally it might be ground to a fine powder in the kitchen mortar. Common salt, the stuff used as a manufacturing material or for salting meat and fish, would have come in large, irregular, slightly grubby-looking chunks. While all the common salt in 17th century America would have been solar salt, in Europe and other parts of the world, common salt could also be mined salt. The chemistry around salt in seawater has a lot of moving parts and dependencies on temperature, ion variety, and local pH. But I will simplify things so we can all get a general picture of how this works. Most seawater has a concentration of dissolved salts at around 3.5%. Most of it is sodium and chloride ions and will crystallize into the sodium chloride that is table salt. But there are also calcium, magnesium, and potassium ions present, as well as other trace minerals that make other sorts of chemical salts. When using seawater to make salt, the first thing that happens is the seawater partially evaporates, concentrating the salt, and it becomes brine. Anything over 5% salt is technically brine, and somewhere around 25% brine is when sodium chloride starts to crystallize. Different bodies of water have different concentrations of different salt-making ions. While the world's oceans average out at about 3.5%, local areas can be much saltier, often warmer places where there is faster evaporation. Inland seas like the Dead Sea and the Caspian Sea have higher concentrations of magnesium, potassium, calcium, and sulfur ions, which make bitter and foul-tasting salts, not to mention possibly poisonous. So they were not used as salt sources for food processing. But where sea salt beds, usually salt marshes, were used for salt production, there was a stepwise concentration method that has been recreated everywhere solar salt production has been undertaken at a large scale. First, seawater would be collected, often at a very high tide, and these are predictable. The water would be left to settle and evaporate a bit. Once it hits that 5% brine level, and experienced people can judge by taste, it would go further into the system of evaporating ponds to make salt. Along the way, as the brine got more concentrated, at the over 10-ish% point, it would either continue on to become salt or might be barreled and used as a local trade good or really more of an industrial supply. Brine was necessary for the best cures of herring, anchovies, mackerel, really any oily fish, and for those late-season green cures of cod. Brine was never shipped overseas. In transoceanic shipping, where space and weight mattered, crystallized salt would be the trade good. So once salt got to the colonial kitchen, whether by a small local manufacturer or was shipped in, how was it used? Brine was used quite a bit in both the 17th century European and colonial kitchen. But that brine would usually be made by adding salt to water, pickling meats, storing it in a barrel of extra salty water with some saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate, could keep pieces of pork good for months. Oh, and how did the good wife know if her brine was salty enough? She'd test it with an egg. A floating egg meant enough salt. If not, she'd add some more salt. Brine would also be used to pickle vegetables and fruits. For vegetable matter, a pickle would also usually include herbs and spices and have some acid. This would either be added vinegar, which is acetic acid, or would acquire lactic acid through some light fermentation. Cucumbers and gherkins were common and a favorite, but walnuts, apples, which were referred to as pippins in the 17th century, crab apples were codlings, beans, cabbage, peaches, artichokes, berries, mushrooms, capers, nasturtiums, anything sweet or savory could get the pickle treatment. Salt packing, layering foods, chunks of meat, fresh vegetables, and even fruits in bay salt inside pottery vessels was also done. Salt would draw moisture out from the vegetable or meat, so these foods would nestle inside their jar in a briny salt bed. Vegetables would keep this way for several months, and salted meats in cool climates could last at least a year. The salted meats of the British Navy were rather notorious, as they were allowed to drain and then packed in barrels with even more salt. So some meat, especially beef, would be as hard as leather or even mistaken for wood, especially the stuff that had sat at the back of the warehouse for a year or a decade or since the last war. Both pickling and salt packing were precursors to modern canning. Glass jars were still expensive, mouth-blown individual objects, and the rolled metal needed for cans was several innovations away. Sugar syrups were used to create expensive sweetmeats, but for general storage, the way we do it in modern canning, this wasn't even imagined. And figuring out heat and pressure canning and pasteurization, this was all about 200 years away. So this is yet another reason raw or fresh vegetables were barely acknowledged. When pickled, vegetables and fruits were cooked as part of the process, or if they were fermented pickles, they would appear cooked. And salt-packed vegetable matter had their proteins denatured, which is just what happens when they are cooked. And as you can imagine, salted fruits looked quite different from their raw counterparts, so they were considered cooked. If you're curious, salted plums, a typical salt-packed fruit in the 17th century, are still a popular snack in much of Asia, Mexico, and parts of South and Central America, Hawaii, and in Australia. In the U.S., they're simple to find at Asian groceries as umeboshi in Japanese, or lihing mui, or huamei in Chinese, and as saladitos in Latin groceries. Modern versions may also include some sugar, but the salty, sweet, sour, zappy flavor is outside the typical modern American taste experience. Also, those preserved lemons everyone has on Instagram or their cooking blog, that is another valid salt-preserved fruit. Just there wouldn't have been many lemons just quite yet, but in the 18th century for sure. Salt was also employed to extend the life of dairy products. Butter was salted to keep it from going rancid. 17th century butter was far saltier than our modern version. As a result, recipes for sweets like cakes or pies would often call for washing the butter before use. Milk made into fresh cheese would either be salted and kept submerged in brine, think ricotta salata or feta. Soaking cheese in brine expels some of the excess water from the cheese, firming it up, and adds salt to the cheese, making it more flavorful. You can see this at work when you compare fancy fresh mozzarella, which is very soft and milky tasting, to more typical string cheese or the mozzarella we shred to put on pizzas at home. This shredding mozzarella has been brined, expelling water, firming it up, and giving it a saltier flavor. And we also know from school lunches that the string cheese can last a decent amount of time out of the fridge. I'm sure you can see that fancy fresh mozzarella would turn to goo pretty quickly. Cheeses that are going to be aged are also brined and then scrubbed with salt to help form a rind. This causes the outside of the cheese to dehydrate, encasing a softer cheese inside. And I'll get into the science and art of all of this when we get to the episode of dairy. The same sort of dehydrated protein crust that forms on cheeses, that can be formed on fish and meat as well. The driest crusts are formed when fish or meat is first lain in and coated with dry salt and then hung somewhere with good circulation. In something thin like a split fish, very often cod, the whole thing would dry. But there would still be a particularly salty crust that would protect it from bacterial, mold, and larger bug invasions. On larger pieces of meat like pork, hams, and bacon, and some cuts of beef or venison, these would be salted and hung in a cool place. As needed, pieces would be cut off for soaking and then added to meals. These larger cured meats would still be quite moist on the inside, unlike the fish, which could be as hard as a plank of wood. That meant they were always in danger of invasion by bugs like mites and descriptively named insects like cheese skippers, larder beetles, and ham beetles. As a way to defend against such invasion, the further step of smoking was often added. Unsurprisingly, as insect life increased, smoked salted meats became more the norm. Thus, the most famous American smoked meats have their roots in places like Virginia, the Carolinas, Mississippi, and Texas. So as you can see, when it came to food in the 17th century, unless it dried on its own, like grain and nuts, could be stored semi-buried like carrots or turnips, or came with a handy hard shell like pumpkins. If you weren't going to eat it today, it needed to get hit with the salt. Meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, and dairy all needed salt to extend their usable life. The colonies didn't have much in the way of salt production when the Europeans arrived, nor once the colonies got going. For most of the century, if salt was needed in any significant quantity, it needed to come in by ship. This was another item that strengthened the trade with the Caribbean, which was also a destination for continental grain, livestock, and cod. The Bahamas especially had highly productive brine ponds. For yet another item, trips back to London lost their luster. Salt was yet another way the continent and the Caribbean began to see themselves as less reliant on back home, less needy of London, and started shifting the economic center. Join me next week when it is time for mercantilism. Like iron, not a food, but definitely a factor that affected what the 17th century British Atlantic ate and what early America would eat. Okay, I've held it together for 2 whole episodes, but my chemistry past is sitting here, tapping me on the shoulder, waiting a second, and tapping again. So if you are interested in what salt is from the chemistry point of view, and how the systemization of chemistry and a growing understanding of what salts were and what they did led to the development of gunpowder, and then how the arrival of gunpowder in Europe, the salt industry, both table and chemical, shipping profits, and war all fed each other in the 17th century. If you're interested in some or all of that, you can hear about it in another bonus episode, which should be out on Friday. Again, nothing essential, but it will help with some of the references I make as I get into deer and venison, probably wood products, and definitely when I make it to 18th century food and beyond. So yes, that means next week is mercantilism, but if you want a little bit more fun on salt, check out the bonus episode. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. As this little podcast is getting itself sorted out, I'd appreciate if you could mention this to someone you know who likes food, or history, or the delicious combination of both. If Twitter is not your thing, and you have questions or quibbles, I am reachable at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. That's all one word and no spaces. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.